and welcome to Ethical Leadership, Voices from Aotearoa, New Zealand, a podcast series commissioned by the Brian Picot Chair in Ethical Leadership, Aritahi, at Victoria University of Wellington, and produced by advisory firm Pocket Knife. This podcast series aims to demystify ethics and make ethical leadership a concept we all become more fluent in and a skill we all become more nimble with. My name is Hélène Malandin, Director of Pocket Knife, and it is my pleasure to be your host for this episode of our podcast series. Today I'm excited to be joined by Guy Ryan. Guy is a purpose-driven leader, a mentor, and a board member. Guy is best known as the founder of Inspiring Stories, a charity that he established in 2011 with the vision of enabling young New Zealanders to realize their potential to change the world. The organization supported over 15,000 young people through initiatives such as the Festival for the Future, the Future Leaders Program, and the Impact Awards. In 2015, Guy was honored as the Young New Zealander of the Year for his contributions to youth development and social enterprise. He is also an Edmund Hillary Fellow, a distinction awarded to individuals demonstrating leadership and a commitment to creating positive change. Just over a year ago, Guy took up a new challenge as the CEO of the Wellington Hospitals Foundation. It's my pleasure to welcome Guy on the podcast today. Guy, a warm welcome to you.
Thank you, Elaine. Great to be here.
Thank you. Thanks for joining me. So good to have you here. So today we're going to try and demystify ethical leadership, guys. And I'd love to discuss what ethical leadership means, of course, to you. If you don't mind, let's go back to 2011, I believe, when you founded Inspiring Stories. I think at the age of 25. Would that be right, Guy? I've lost you.
24.
So I suspect you did not think of yourself as an ethical leader back then, based on your age, but I may be wrong. But you had it in you, right? So can you tell us a bit about from what you can remember, what motivated you to start a charity to support young people to realize their potential back then?
Yeah, sure. So I guess just prior to founding Inspiring Stories, I had always been really interested in the idea of entrepreneurship. And I dabbled in a few things. You know, I guess I grew up in a beautiful place on the west coast of the South Island and always had this really close affinity with nature and the sense of community. And I guess that's kind of carried with me throughout lots of things that I've done. Prior to Inspiring Stories, I had co-founded a film production company focused on producing documentary content, especially and promotional content. It was really about education and environmental action. And a film that I produced as part of my master's told the stories of 4 young people taking action on climate change. And I seen how powerful the stories of these young people could be to inspire others. The film went on to win the Colorado International Film Festival. I was one of 3 finalists in the world for the BBC's Best Newcomer Award. And really seeing how powerful that could be, I thought, wow, well, you know, imagine how many other young people there are out there doing great things for our communities and country. What would it take to supercharge that? And so I pitched this idea to a corporate at the time, Vodafone, and was lucky enough to win one of their World of Difference scholarships, which would support you for 1 year if you were successful to head a youth-focused project of your choice. So that was really the genesis of Inspiring Stories, drawing on my interest in entrepreneurship, film production, storytelling, marketing. And I just had this idea. I just thought, imagine if every young New Zealander unleashed their potential to change the world, what would it take to make that happen? And that was a big drive that got me out of bed for a very long time, pouring my heart and soul into an organisation, and a fascinating learning adventure, I guess, as well.
That is wonderful. And I'm loving what you're saying about, you know, that part of the community you lived in and you grew up in, and not only the people, but also the importance of the environment and the beauty of the environment and wanting to protect this and wanting to cherish it. Would you say your values, like you've talked about, like them in your, you know, young years as a young adult, do you feel like they've evolved as you matured as a person and as a can you see whether there's an evolution there, or do you think they've been cemented, or how would you describe that kind of journey you've been on, and whether the values have changed through time?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think the values, or my values, would have been pretty consistent. You know, they would have evolved a little bit over over time. I guess one tangible example, when I started doing all of that work in my 80s, I didn't have kids. Now I've got a 5-year-old and an 8-year-old. And so that's an immediate shift. And not so much values, but a little bit, but it definitely influences your priorities as well. I think my values would have been pretty consistent throughout that journey, even though the context has changed a lot. And I think that's one of the really interesting things about leadership or ethical leadership is, great leadership in one context, or what's needed for great leadership, can actually be radically different in a different context, and I think where I got to with my journey building inspiring stories and a national youth development organisation, I knew the context really well. I became increasingly confident in the decisions that I was making, why I was making those things. Whereas now I've taken on a new role and I'm kind of like a tiny fish in a big ocean, and actually I can't just do exactly what I did. Back then I have to really deeply understand the context, and it's a different set of challenges. Still trying to bring those values into this new context, but the way in which I approach it just has to be different as well.
That is so interesting. So you're finding yourself being a slightly different leader. So just after 14 years of building an organization from scratch, and like you say, like leading not a small team, but a tight team that was really looking to you for direction and vision because you were the founder, to finding yourself now in a role. Tell me a bit more about it, because I don't want to put words in your mouth, but at the Wellington Hospitals Foundation, where the context is very different in so many ways. And so you're finding yourself being the leader that's drawing upon the same value set, but you can see how you are implementing these values, these beliefs in a different way. Would that be right?
Yeah. So I guess in terms of just painting the contrast of those two different contexts there, for a lot of the things that I have done previously, I've come up with the idea, I've shaped it, I've built a team around me, I've kind of, led the vision and the implementation of whatever the strategy was. And so you have this huge amount of autonomy in that context, right? And what I've stepped into more recently is taking on a new role as the chief executive at the Wellington Hospitals Foundation. So we're the official charity for Health New Zealand for the Wellington region. So we're an independent legal entity, a charity, but we exist very much to serve and support Health New Zealand and our hospitals across the Wellington region. And I didn't set that up. And in fact, quite different. I'm stepping in from somebody who built it from scratch and who led that role for 20 years, and that my predecessor, that person, built the team, built the culture, built the strategy, built the systems, built everything, and achieved amazing things. But for me stepping in, that's a completely different context. I'm the second youngest employee. I don't have a background in the health sector, and we're set up to support 3 public hospitals across the region. Even just finding your way around those hospitals, can be a bit of a mission. So radically different context, and loads of sensitivities to kind of navigate to figure out, well, who are we as an organisation? Who are we as a team? What is our North Star? Where are we trying to go? And how do I bring those values into that context and try and lead in a way that feels really authentic to who I am, but really respectful of the many different sensitivities and competing priorities in this new context.
Are you also getting external advice? May that be from, reading, researching transitions such as these, in other organizations and what works, and or getting some advice, mentoring and coaching potentially from the outside world as well? Is that part of the mix?
Yeah. So just comparing and contrasting some of those different contexts again. So what I built previously within that kind of youth development, youth leadership space, we built from scratch on the smell of an oily rag, and honestly trying to make stuff financially viable in that youth development, youth leadership context is extremely hard. But one of the amazing things about that is that it forces you to be innovative, creative, resourceful, lean. And what I've stepped into is a charity, but it's in a much stronger place financially. I mean, part of it just blows my mind. And so one of those differences has been starting from a place of financial strength. Yeah. And so actually, even though I've, I guess, cut my teeth or learned, through such a lean environment, having to figure out how to make magic work on the smell of an oily rag, suddenly we've got a bit of resource around it. And that has afforded us the opportunity to work with some scan the market and find some great partners, but to work with a range of organisations across those different pillars of transformation who have deep expertise. We have to pay them for it and they give us a charitable discount, but that affords us the opportunity to work with sector specialists, whether that's in the technology space or the brand space or retail space or HR and organisational change processes. So that's been amazing. But I guess similar approach, but just starting from a slightly different level of resourcing around it. And this is an organisation, with 20 years of credibility and track record. Like I said, a different set of challenges, but wanting to bring those values, back through as much as possible. So really thinking about, what's the social impact of the work that we're doing or the change processes that we're leading, and what might this mean for the team, the board, the founder, some of our key stakeholders. We also manage, over 500 volunteers who help out across the different hospitals. Luckily, we're always having to think, what does this mean from a financial sustainability perspective? I guess there's two key parts of that for us as an organisation. One, we're a fundraising organisation, so really we want to be making money and raising funds to support the various needs of our hospitals across the region. There's a balance there where we actually have to support the organisation, the engine that underpins and enables all of that. And there's some tension there because we do need to make some strategic investments, including the things that I mentioned, technology and capability, systems, etc. And that stuff costs money. And if we spend that money, that means for a period, less money that we're giving out to our hospitals. But that's done with a long-term view that actually if we get this infrastructure right and we do this transformation, ultimately that means that we will be in a position to significantly improve the sustainable fundraising revenue that we can unlock longer term to support our hospitals. Balancing those kind of short-term and long-term priorities. There's always moving parts and nothing's ever simple.
And balancing the short term and long term, but also the personal and the common good, right? Because back to your point, the people are in it because they share a vision and hopefully they share values. To what extent do you feel people are, because you were talking about the volunteers, and that's what triggered my question, I suppose, because I'm really aware that volunteers, such a large force of volunteers is such an important asset for an organization, in particular, one like yours, where they're usually extremely invested, extremely values aligned, they are a big part of the image of the organization and the voice of the organization on the ground. Do you feel like it's a coherent organization in terms of values? I mean, we've talked about your personal values, but the values of the organization, do you feel like there's coherence there, or is there a great opportunity for you moving forward, thinking about that aspect of being an ethical leader and bringing coherence to an organization on that level? What's the situation and what's ahead of you?
Yeah, great question. I certainly think that there is an opportunity for recalibration and alignment there. I have multiple factors there to consider. So my predecessor, who's now the chair, built the organisation from scratch over 20 years. And there's 40 years difference in age between us, and within that, similar values, but very different leadership styles, and my predecessor, like I mentioned, has built the team, built the organisation, built everything around their leadership style, their preferences, their likes, their dislikes. I think everybody has been drawn to the organisation in alignment with the purpose that the organisation stands for, right? So making a difference for our hospitals and healthcare across the region. So I think everyone's attracted to the organisation for the right reasons. We did a little bit of work early on as part of the brand refresh process to try and understand the perception that some of our stakeholders had of us as a foundation and our work. And super interesting, I'm coming at this from quite a neutral perspective, but what that highlighted was actually how we might have thought about ourselves internally. Actually, there was some differing perceptions, across our different stakeholder groups. And, even for example, for some of our volunteers, of which there's more than 500, they don't necessarily talk about working with the foundation. They might just talk about volunteering for our hospitals. If we want to build a brand and some really clear brand values that underpin how we want to be perceived externally, for me, it's really important that all of our key stakeholders are aligned and singing from the same song sheet around that. And so we're still, again, early on in that process, but I think having a really shared vision, Western value set for who we are, how we want to work together, the impact that we make is a really important piece of development that still need to do. Yeah, so we, like I said, we're going through a brand refresh process at the moment, but it's not like, oh, you launch a new logo and that's it. It's so much more complex than that. There's so many things, even within that example transformation project, that we need to click in place to, ensure that ideally all of our key stakeholders really intuitively know who we are, why we exist, how they can get involved, and how to talk about us and how to champion us to their peers and their colleagues,
And you're a fantastic storyteller. Like you said, you started as a filmmaker. And so this is also an amazing experience and skills that you bring to the table through this angle and this lens, and the importance of storytelling and shared storytelling internally before it can manifest with, credibility and externally as well. So having your people singing from the same song sheet, as you say, is really important. Talking about this, the storytelling part is something that's really, close to your heart and something that you've practiced through the years. I was thinking about going back to 14 years at Inspiring Stories. Are there like 2-3 major lessons that you learned that you're bringing through in this new role, or lessons learned in terms of ethical dilemma, or some mistakes that you may have made, because don't we all, that you learn from, that are always top of mind because they're really stuck with you because probably it was quite a hard time, or you're just so aware of the fact that that was such a treasure learning that you build upon in this new role? Are there particular experiences, particular failures and mistakes that you made through the years that are really a big part of who you are as a leader?
Yeah, I think there's probably a few. And I guess, so stepping into the Wellington Hospitals Foundation, I'd never heard of the organisation before the role came up. Despite having 2 little kids, both that were born at Wellington Hospital, spent lots of time there, knew about the hospital, but had never heard about the foundation before. And in taking on the role, I had a fair bit of imposter syndrome. Like, this is an amazing organisation when I kind of dig, beneath the surface. Why have I been given this opportunity, and what can I bring, that's actually going to shift the needle or make a difference here? And so as a leader, you kind of sit with that discomfort probably for a longer period of time. And the more I kind of get into it, the more I'm like, oh yeah, actually, I think I can add some value here. Coming back to the question, and are there things in that kind of earlier journey, any of those lessons that might apply to the new context? I think there is. I think one of the interesting things about working within such a public-facing organisation within the Hospitals Foundation, like literally our offices are in the main hospital in Newtown, and we've got staff at Kenepuru Hospital and Aotearoa Heart Hospital in the Heart. So there's all these things that happen all the time in a hospital environment where there's no shortage of need. I think everybody is aware that our health system is under huge pressure at the moment, and government funding only stretches so far. And because you're in that context with literally thousands of Health New Zealand staff, tens of thousands of patients coming through the door all of the time, it's really easy to get distracted. It's just come up. And I think one of the most important things for us as an organisation has actually been to get really clear on strategy. Where are we going? What does success look like? Let's distill that down into 5 key priorities and really focus on nailing those. And I mean, you can't ignore everything else that's going on, but just really trying to be really clear, strategic, focused. And within that is that ambition, which I talked about earlier on. Like, the easier approach would have not been to have an ambitious new strategy. The easier approach would have been, let's just do what we've always done, try and do a little bit better at it. And I think for me coming in, there was a real, sense of uniqueness and beauty and being able to see stuff with fresh eyes. And that doesn't last forever, right? You only have that kind of perception of fresh eyes for a limited period of time. So to kind of acknowledge that and put value on that, I guess, and actually go, here's where we're at. Here's some things that actually I think aren't going to work for us, as we look to the future. Here's a bunch of things that we're going to have to do quite differently to support that transformation. Let's be really bold and ambitious about that. Let's be really focused on strategy, and let's prioritise what needs to happen to enable that. And that has also meant having to say no to some things or doing less of some things. That can be challenging as well when you've got for example, the long-standing founder of 20 years, who's now my boss and is the chair, and similarly, there's people in the team that might have been there for nearly 20 years as well. There's a lot of emotional investment, in the way that things have always been done, and that can be a really interesting thing to navigate. And for me, it has been so important to try and approach that in a way that feels really genuinely authentic, respectful, diplomatic, because actually those relationships are too important to break, and sometimes if you damage relationships, they can't be mended. So really we get one shot at this, and sometimes that means that actually, even though I'm coming in with a new agenda and pushing for ambition and transformation, if there's too much tension, in some of those things, and actually if that brings the risk of damaging some really important relationships to the foundation, I'm just going to have to step back and respect that and be a bit more patient and take a longer term view on things.
Loving the clarity you have on all of this. 12 months in, Guy. That's amazing. Thank you. There was something else I wanted to ask you about you, and that was, again, looking back, when you were, honoured as Young New Zealander of the Year 15. That came with a kind of a new level of public exposure, and kind of meant you become even more of a role model for aspiring change makers. And again, I could see this being one of the people evolving in the same spheres as you. Like, now in hindsight, I'm curious, did this change you, getting that sort of level of public exposure? Did it give you a chance to maybe reflect on your leadership style, or did it crystallize who you were already? What was the change there, if any?
Yeah, probably lots of changes, I think. So when the Young New Zealander of the Year announcement happens, one of the things that come with that is public expectation. And one element of that is that you get a lot of requests to speak at different things, hundreds of things, whether that's university graduation ceremonies or coming in to speak at businesses or to schools or all sorts of stuff. So really interestingly, in my much younger years, I used to hate public speaking. It terrified me, and I would avoid it at every opportunity. And then slowly but surely getting to lean into that discomfort. And, even though I might not have enjoyed it initially, you figure out how to get good at stuff, and what are those things that can hopefully help to move hearts and minds and leave an audience feeling like they take some value out of what it's sharing. And I guess with that, probably another level up in terms of needing to be able to engage with such a diverse range of stakeholders, confidently and to kind of be relatable to such different audiences, whether that's prime ministers or mayors or chief executives, right through to young people or community organisations, and spending time, from literally some of our most lower socioeconomic challenged rural communities in New Zealand, right through to, engaging with senior leaders in some of the top tier organisations. Being able to, I guess one of the things I learned out of those opportunities was the confidence and the ability to engage in what could be very different spheres there. I also, off the back of winning that, I was probably even more confident and even more ambitious. And that's not necessarily a good thing. One of those things that I tried to do off the back of winning the Young New Zealander of the Year award was launch a campaign to try and raise $1 million that we would use to back young people to bring their bold ideas for change to life. And that campaign failed. It failed miserably. And I guess my confidence took a big hit. I had thought, okay, well, Young New Zealander of the Year, now's the time to do something audacious here for the right reasons. But no, it failed. And I think for me, as an emerging young leader, I don't come from any money. I don't come from any wealth, and that's perhaps one of the interesting challenges with trying to get, some of these kind of purpose-driven or impact-driven ideas off the ground. You can have the best idea, but actually if you can't secure the resources or the funding around you, it doesn't necessarily mean anything, if it's not viable and if you can't sustain it. So coming back to the kind of, I guess that framework or definition around ethical leadership, when you're trying to consider social impact and outcomes, environmental impact and outcomes, economic and financial economic and outcomes. All of those different paths are all kind of moving in different ways over time. And one thing that might have worked perfectly in one context, suddenly things can change and it no longer stacks up and you've got to adapt or develop a new approach to that stuff. So I guess lots of moving parts, and I guess that's one of the beautiful things about leadership is that it's never boring. You've always got new curveballs, you've always got new challenges, new problems to solve, and so it forces you to kind of always be learning, always be trying to stay in tune with the context and the stakeholders around you as to how you move forwards.
I love these two thoughts, Guy. Like you've touched on two very important things around sustainability, be financial or emotional or everything, the ability to adapt and be flexible and learn and iterate. It's all good to say, I'm going to lead with integrity and fairness and accountability and respect. But, you need to have the conditions to be able to do this. And I think sustainability and ability to be agile and adapt and learn are important conditions in order to be able to be this leader. So thank you. That was incredible hearing about all of your experience. And like I said, incredibly amazed by the clarity that you have 12 months into a role like this one, around, what is happening, what is the situation around you, and how you go with so much intention and humility and care about, being the best leader you can be for this organization. So you mentioned how you obviously built an organization from scratch at Inspiring Stories, and you were that core kind of node in the middle, and you created a team around you that bought into your vision straight away and look up to you for everything. So I'm kind of hearing that was a bit of a heropreneur type of situation there, which is not unusual in a self-founded startup style and company. What have you learned around the risk of such a setup and such a leadership style, and how different is it now in the context of the Wellington Hospital Foundations?
Great question. I guess, and at the time probably without any awareness of it, building an organisation with me at the centre, and when you're building it literally from scratch, from startup, there's so many hats you have to wear. You're figuring out finance, fundraising, what does sustainable revenue model look like? You're doing all your stakeholder relations, you're doing the design stuff, the web development, the promotions, the marketing, the recruitment, the training, the onboarding, the everything, So just because of the stage and the nature of that stage of development, you wear so many hats, it can be a really challenging thing, especially in a resource-constrained environment, how you go from that to then having a bit more scale and perhaps a few more layers in an organisation, particularly if you're in a resource-constrained environment and you can't necessarily hire or commit to long-term employment for a leadership team or additional permanent roles and things like that. So it's a real conundrum. And then it also opens up lots of challenges around succession. If you've built something that's so dependent on a single founder and that founder having so many different skill sets and wearing so many different hats, that can be really hard to replace with a single human. And I think I've seen that in stepping into this new organisation that I didn't found, that I didn't set up, but another person did. And there are many things that have been very dependent on that one human, and that person similarly had to wear all of those different hats in setting it up. And so for me, one of the things I'm really mindful coming in is succession. How do I evolve this organisation in a way that is actually not just dependent on a single human? So how do you actually build that resilience into the organisation from the outset? So there's a number of ways that I'm approaching that. One of those ways is through that organisational restructure that we've just been through. The organisation, up until I started, has been very flat. Most people reported into the chief executive. The chief executive, was kind of, empowered to make decisions on heaps of things. I want to change that. And so establishing a leadership team, with a head of fundraising, a head of marketing communications, a head of volunteering, for example, and actually wanting to ensure that that leadership team feel really empowered and have the autonomy to make important decisions within their respective functional areas across the organisation. And I guess trying to design this in a way that, look, if something happens to me as chief executive, if I get hit by a bus, the organisation's not going to fall over. And hopefully when I step back from the organisation and it's time to recruit a new chief executive, you're not needing a new chief executive that has to have deep knowledge and skills across 20 different areas, because actually you've got that level of capability, those skill sets threaded throughout the organisation. So yeah, I guess that's one of the things that I'm really mindful of as part of this next phase of development. Super interesting and different challenges trying to take an organisation from 0 to 1 than it is to take an organisation from 1 to 2. And I'm really liking this new space.
Yeah, what fantastic learning, What fantastic learning that you're bringing from 14 years of running an organization you started to this new context. It's amazing. It's been fantastic, Guy, to hear all of the differences, but also similarities in these two roles of yours. Like I said, amazing to get your level of clarity around what these are and how you're going about managing these the best way you can. I think I'm going to leave us with 3 key words. You talked to us about the importance of the conditions in order to be that ethical leader. And one is sustainability, one is agility and learning, and the other one you just touched on is the resilience of the organization and the people around you. And so all of these are super important, right, to be that moral leader and that moral person. Thank you so much for your time. It's been just wonderful talking to you today. And thank you for joining us on the podcast.
Thank you for having me. It's been fun.
Thank you for listening. This was an episode of Ethical Leadership, Voices of Aotearoa, New Zealand, a podcast collection commissioned by the Brian Picot Chair in Ethical Leadership, Aritahi, at Victoria University of Wellington. I hope you enjoyed the episodes as much as I'm enjoying the fabulous conversations with our guest speakers. Stay tuned for more.